Hi everybody, welcome back to City Limits Stand-Up Desk. I'm Jarrett Murphy, here with Nick Petrie from Make the Road New York, and Nick will be talking about Bay Street area in Staten Island today. And let's talk about it for those who haven't ventured to Staten Island, which you definitely should. Absolutely. This is the corridor in question. This is a map prepared by City Planning. Describe us, this is the City Planning study area.
Yeah.
But for you, what is the neighborhood we're talking about? I mean, in terms of borders and roughly where it lies on the line.
Absolutely. So the study area is this Bay Street corridor, right? Which is just this red area, which hopefully in Facebook land you all can see. That is just specifically where the rezoning is going to happen, right? That's primarily waterfront, a lot of now manufacturing space. The thing I think that's really key about how this will play out on Staten Island is because it's so much less dense and because it's just going to have a huge outsized impact, right? This orange line around is what the city thinks of as their context area. So that would include St. George, Stapleton, Clifton, those sort of surrounding areas. The point of contention, as is often happening when you draw maps like this, right, is that if we go down, right, so here is the right southern part of the context area, and this, you can't really totally see, but the bottom line of it is Vanderbilt Avenue, yeah? That boundary, right, on the southern side of that boundary is the Park Hill Project Space Section 8 complex, which is one of the biggest affordable housing complexes on Staten Island outside of NYCHA. And it's literally like right across the street. And the way the context area works is that those are the people whose incomes they take into consideration to count what the median income of the neighborhood is.
Right.
Right?
And probably also where, if I'm correct, I might be wrong in this, when they're doing the environmental assessments, that's the area they're looking for, displacement impact, other, potentially mitigable or not mitigable impacts of the rezoning.
Exactly.
So tell me about the area, either within the context or you're familiar with. What's the neighborhood like? Who's living there? What's the mix of people like?
Oh, this is my favorite question. So the North Shore of Staten Island, and particularly around St. George and Stapleton, is actually remarkably diverse. In Stapleton, there is like an African American community that's been there for many years now. There's also a huge range of African immigrant communities. There's, I think, the largest outside of Liberia.
Liberian community, right?
Liberian community. Like Sierra Leonean, Ghanaian, Nigerian, huge Sri Lankan community, Albanian community, and then there's like lots of Spanish-speaking folks as well. So folks from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, and then more recently folks that have come like the last 10 years from Mexico. So it's quite an eclectic place, right? Which I think makes it incredible. It has a really interesting mix of all of these different groups of both immigrants and folks who were born here, having sort of built interlocking communities on top of each other. And so it's a community where you can like walk down the block and get incredible tacos and then walk to the next place and like be in the Liberian church and walk to the next place and be in like the historically black Baptist church where they like have done organizing for 40 years, right?
And mainly like multifamily buildings rental or small homes or?
So in the context area, 80% of the housing is unregulated, right? Which means it's going to be single family homes, small rentals. There's a fair bit of like two family on top, right? There is that 20% that's rent stabilized, where there's a lot more protection. But generally, right, the big challenge that we're facing is that there's nowhere near the same kind of legal protection, right, for folks who are renting in single-family homes or in buildings that are too small to be regulated, which really poses a sort of immediate displacement risk.
And so talk about, I know the rezoning process is at a relatively early stage.
Yeah.
Tell us about where it is and kind of what rough sense you have of what the city is talking about doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So where we're at in the rezoning process now is that in I guess a year ago now, the city put out their draft scope of work, right? So we saw the draft scope, or rather that was a couple months before, and then we commented on it a year ago now. where we submitted our comments. So that gave us the broad strokes of what they were thinking in terms of what the environmental impact, right, state will say, and what's going on. Since then, the process has slowed, so now we are sort of in the limbo between completing the environmental impact study and certifying a ULURP. So in some ways there's a benefit, right? Like we're not quite on the clock yet, but otherwise, right, it's like quite moving along. And then in terms of like broad strokes, so we know from what they want to study a couple things. The first is that the waterfront that's going to be rezoned, it's now mostly manufacturing land, and they primarily want to upzone it to being R6 residential, which for folks that are not like zoning nerds, which are my favorite type of people.
Sure.
Right.
Especially in their audience.
That's
We
right.
welcome them in their
That's
friends.
right.
Yeah.
So R6 is kind of a funky housing designation, but not a bad, R6 can be pretty large. So we're talking about, like on these lots, we're talking about 7-story buildings that are like, think of like half a block long kind of deal, right? So it's much denser housing than the rest of the neighborhood, dramatically so. All the surrounding really is much smaller, either single-family homes or, right, like rentals, small rentals. So from that, we know that there's that upzone plan. It also is right next to the Stapleton waterfront development, which is this development project that's been spearheaded by EDC that is part of the Stapleton, there's this North Shore 2030 plan,
Right.
Which talks about, okay, here's all the things we want for the North Shore. We want to have like a vibrant tourist economy. We want to have all these other investments. And so the Stapleton waterfront, the first 2 stages of that were developed, public land that was disposed of to a private developer, developed into Irby, which is this big, several hundred units. I think it's now 600. Almost entirely luxury development. And so that piece, I think, is in some ways gives us the best sense in some of what the plan is, potentially a cautionary tale.
How much awareness, and you work with communities there,
Yeah.
people know this is in the offing? Like, what's the level of awareness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, it really varies. I think that the reality is that rezonings and land use actions like this sit at the incredibly, in some ways, dangerous intersection of quite wonky and also really important. And so it's not uncommon that what will happen is folks will be like, oh, okay, I'm not totally sure what a rezoning is, and I'm not sure why I should care. That being said, I do think that there's 2 things that have been really resonated with folks. The first is there's just like a very clear, oh, okay, I see this building is being built, right? And I see that the rent is $3,300 a month, right? And I'm paying $15, and so I definitely can't do that, right? It's clear that that is not for me.
Right.
The other thing is that, so when we do workshops with our member institutions, with the churches, tenant associations, community groups that we're organizing with, we often start that conversation by saying, so who here remembers what Williamsburg looked like, right? Because we actually think that there are a lot of points that are analogous, right? It's a waterfront rezoning that's going from a manufacturing to a residential. It's relatively easy to get on public transportation to the sort of central core. And we like to joke in the workshops, they're both neighborhoods where everyone would say, you would want to live there 15 years ago, and now is, right, skyrocketing. And it's often the case that people say, oh yeah, I'm from Williamsburg, and I was displaced, and now I live here, so I absolutely understand what this means, because, right, I've lived it.
One of the things that's going on there, parallel to, maybe even kind of related to the rezoning process, is an effort to create, or really just more to sort of map and identify the art scene there, which is pretty strong on the North Shore.
Yeah.
There's a future culture project, and what do you think about that? Is that a scene that working class people who live in that area are aware of, are tapped into? And do you feel like the effort to kind of galvanize that as an entity, as a cultural spot,
Yeah.
is that helpful to trying to preserve the neighborhood and what's good there, or is that a potential threat?
So the short answer is I don't know. And the reason I'm saying I don't know is because it's not something like so. In the many conversations I've had with our leaders and members on Staten Island, it's quite rare that talking about the art scene as like a thing that is. Let me rephrase that. When they talk about their neighborhood, the things that they're talking about are like, I know the people that live on my block, I trust them, I know my church, right? Like there is a real cohesive community, and the arts piece is not something that I've heard a lot about. Doesn't mean that it's not something that's hugely important to them. What I will say is that on it's not quite an arts piece, though I think it does maybe speak to misalignment of the need in the neighborhood versus what seem through their actions to be the city's priorities, which is that, so there's several pieces of public land that are going to be disposed of through the rezoning, right, in sort of a parallel process. One of those, and now I'm blanking on if it's the public land on Central Avenue or Stuyvesant in St. George, currently is a city-owned office building. Our folks that looked at zoning think we could put housing here, and instead EDC is saying like this has to be like a tech jobs innovation hub, right? And we're in a neighborhood where like when the Stapleton Library started getting the Wi-Fi things that they could like rent you for 5 months, people were like super excited because it was like, oh wow, I can afford internet now. That's amazing, right? And so there's a real disconnect between we think the jobs that we want to develop here are going to be these like highly skilled, right, high paying, which is awesome, tech jobs. There's sort of a training pipeline, investment in resources gap, right? To be able to get the folks in the neighborhood there. So I do think that there's definitely cases of sort of a mismatch between what the plan thinks are the neighborhood's needs versus what a lot of residents articulate.
In some neighborhoods where rezonings have been contemplated or are being discussed, folks have said, we just don't want any rezoning. We think the best thing to do is leave this alone.
Yeah.
Do you feel as though it's possible that a rezoning could help the neighborhood, could improve it for the folks you work for? Or like, how do you feel about the prospect of a rezoning sort of writ large?
Totally. So the rezoning is, I think, both an incredible opportunity and also an incredible risk, right? The reality is that, like, done wrong, the rezoning could very rapidly displace huge chunks of the neighborhood, right? Like that 80% of people who live in unregulated housing. That being said, right, if the rising cost of rent continues, there will be many people who can't afford their rent regardless. Now, I have to say, right, there's definitely a connection between doing rezonings and the rising cost of rent, right? Sometimes there's an argument that gets made that's saying, oh, gentrification will happen inevitably, therefore we should do a rezoning because it's the way to mitigate it. And that actually isn't the case, right? Like, there are lots of forces that go into gentrification, but I do think that sometimes an upzoning, residential upzoning can increase those property values and lead to more pressures, even without construction, just because it fuels speculation and so on. That being said, right, if this is an opportunity where we can be building deeply, meaningfully affordable housing, right, and can be implementing some of the really critical preservation policies that we need for the North Shore, then I think it could be a win.
And do you think the city's listening? Like in the process you've seen so far, do you feel as though they've been responsive to some of the concerns that people have articulated?
Well, so I'll say this. There definitely have been some very good conversations we've had with the city. There have been some really good conversations we've had with Councilmember Rose. I think that we are, we put in our comments to the draft scope, right? Like, we need, the things that our members said were absolutely critical were, we need to have deeply affordable housing. You've got to get to 30% of AMI and below, right? So many of the folks in the neighborhood who are really struggling are there. You need to be putting in anti-tenant harassment zones. You need to be protecting people against eviction by neglect, all these things. My sincere hope is that the city will come back and say to us, great, right?
Sure.
We think this is, I think that their actions will demonstrate if they're listening, right? We've had many conversations. I think the question now is, right?
What happens next?
What happens next?
Speaking of that, this is not the only kind of land use issue in which this area could
Yeah.
be involved. I mean, there's talk about closing Rikers, locating new borough-based facilities. The
Yeah.
mayor has expressed some opinions about whether Staten Island needs a
Sure.
jail, I should say.
Right.
If there is a jail in Staten Island,
Yes.
it could be fairly close to this area. It could be in the Stapleton near the courthouse. It could be. Have you gauged yet the folks you work with and kind of represent whether people will be open
Sure.
to that?
Yeah, so the first answer I would say is like we have a whole process, right? So like the Staten Island Housing Dignity Coalition, we have our executive board, and there's a whole set of bylaws that are like, here are the ways that we make decisions, right?
Right.
And so my preface is
You're not
we've not
speaking
done
to that, right?
Exactly.
But your sort of rough sense.
Rough sense.
Yeah.
So, there have been a lot of really, really painful conversations, particularly over the last 6 months, with people, like a lot of, just a lot of mothers whose sons and daughters have been arrested and are at Rikers. And the pain of knowing that their child is in such an intensely violent and traumatic place. And, right, as has been talked about a lot, and I think bears repeating, right, like, getting to Rikers is hard. And so if you're a home health aide and your schedule is 8 to 8, and you're trying to go visit your child, getting there is quite difficult. And so, there is, I think, a really critical human part of being able to have people in the community so that their family and community can be there to support them. The other thing I would say is that there's a lot of incredible sort of restorative justice work that happens on Staten Island. There's the Center for Interpersonal Development who do interesting conflict resolution work. There are folks in the schools. There's violence interrupters in different neighborhoods. When there have been shootings, there's this group, Occupy the Block, that's just amazing folks that just literally are mostly elders from the Black community, go and are in the community where there's a shooting and talk to people and sort of are there to be supportive, right? And so my sense there, and I just bring that up because I think there's a lot of really good work happening already in terms of how do we have fewer people go to Rikers. And I can definitely say for the people that I've had those painful conversations with, they would love to have their child closer to home.
So a last question, and this is about sort of life on Staten Island in general.
Yeah.
When we talk about the Staten Island in terms of the citywide conversation, what you often hear is that Staten Islanders feel as though they're an afterthought, they're a distant
Yeah.
cousin, and not really part of the city.
Yeah.
But that typically is talked about in terms of the Staten Islander you imagine, a white
Right.
homeowner,
Right.
right?
Yes.
The people that you have a chance to work with, who many of them are not white, they're working class,
Yes.
they may be renters, not homeowners.
Right.
Do they feel like they are part of the larger city, or do they also feel kind of like a neglected afterthought because they live on this island that's a ferry boat or a long bridge away?
I have to say, I think they feel like they're doubly an afterthought, right? They feel like not only are we on Staten Island and so we're far away and people are not engaged, but also when there are things that are speaking to Staten Island, they're speaking for the North Shore, the much more vocal minority of white homeowners, right, of more affluent white homeowners, as opposed to the much more diverse community. And so I think there's many layers. There's the forgotten borough layer, and then there's also in our community, our needs are already so often at the bottom of the agenda, right, and they're not being lifted up in this local context or the citywide context. Mm-hmm. So I think that's yes, definitely important.
Well, Nick Petrie, thanks for talking us through the layers.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.